Today, we're going to reveal 8 UK supermarket spices you must avoid. We're talking about cancer-causing mycotoxins in nearly 1 in 10 samples and contaminations that triggered the biggest food recall in European history. These spices were flagged for contamination, adulteration, and toxic compounds by the FSA. These aren't obscure ingredients you've never heard of. These are the spices sitting in your kitchen right now. Spice number 1. Oregano. When 3/4 of your herb is actually olive leaves. Contamination and outright fraud. The Food Standards Agency's authenticity testing examined 30 oregano samples from UK retail stores. 4 of those samples, that's 13%, contained leaves that weren't oregano at all. 3 samples had olive leaves mixed in, making up between 10% and 25% of the total contents. Let me be completely clear about what that means. If you bought one of those jars, up to 1/4 of what you paid for was a different plant entirely. During microscopic examination, investigators also found insect fragments and pieces of synthetic fiber in the samples. One oregano sample had so much foreign material and such abnormal sensory characteristics that it was ruled non-compliant under the Food Safety Act 1990. That's the legal terminology for, this is not what it claims to be. And here's where oregano gets genuinely dangerous. One sample tested by the FSA had high levels of lead. Now, there's no specific UK legal limit for lead in dried oregano, which is itself a regulatory failure we'll address. But high levels of a neurotoxin in something you're sprinkling on your pizza, stirring into your bolognese sauce, rubbing onto your roast chicken, that's accumulating in your body with every meal. So, which brands are affected? Again, the FSA doesn't publicly name specific brands in surveillance sampling, but their testing covered oregano sold at major UK supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, Morrisons, and potentially budget brands like East End or Raja. The contamination exists across the supply chain, not just in one brand or one price point. Why does this fraud happen? Follow the money. Oregano commands premium prices because of its distinctive, pungent flavor. It's labor-intensive to harvest. You're picking leaves from relatively small plants. Olive leaves, by contrast, are essentially agricultural waste. Olive groves produce tons of leaves during pruning and harvest. They look similar to oregano when dried and crushed, especially once they're ground fine enough. By bulking out oregano with 10, 15, even 25% olive leaves, processors and packagers can increase their profit margins dramatically. They're selling you worthless filler at herb prices. And unless someone specifically tests for authenticity using microscopy, which requires taking samples, examining them under magnification, identifying plant structures, and comparing them to reference standards, no one catches it. Your local trading standards office isn't routinely testing the Schwartz oregano at Tesco. The FSA does periodic surveillance, which is how we know this fraud exists. But periodic surveillance isn't comprehensive protection. Think about the cooking implications. When your recipe calls for a tablespoon of oregano, you're relying on that specific flavor profile to make the dish work. If what's in the jar is only 75 to 85% oregano, diluted with olive leaves that taste completely different, your food suffers. You add more, trying to hit the right flavor, which means you're consuming more of whatever else is in there, including potentially that lead contamination. The oregano fraud isn't unique to the UK. The EU's Food Fraud Network has documented this as a recurring problem across Europe. Spice number 2. Ground nutmeg. The mycotoxin contamination no one's talking about. Number 2. Ground nutmeg, because this one surprised even the Food Standards Agency researchers. Between 2023 and 2024, FSA laboratories tested 89 samples of nutmeg, turmeric, and oregano for mycotoxins. The result? 9% had levels above regulatory limits, And here's the critical detail buried in that surveillance report. The contamination was mainly concentrated in ground nutmeg. So what does that actually mean for you? If you walk down the spice aisle at Tesco, Sainsbury's or Asda and pick up a jar of ground nutmeg, whether it's Schwartz, Tesco own brand, Sainsbury's value range, or any other label, there's roughly a 1 in 11 chance that jar contains mycotoxins above the legal safety threshold. Now, let me decode what mycotoxins actually are, because toxic mold compounds sounds abstract until you understand the mechanism. These are chemicals produced by specific types of fungi that colonize crops during growth, harvesting, or storage. The mycotoxins the FSA was testing for include aflatoxins and ochratoxin A. Aflatoxins are classified as Group 1 carcinogens. That's the same category as asbestos and tobacco smoke. They cause liver cancer. Ochratoxin A damages your kidneys and suppresses your immune system. Here's what makes this particularly insidious with ground nutmeg. Think about how you use it. It goes in your bechamel sauce for lasagna, your rice pudding, your Christmas baking, your mulled wine, your porridge. If you're using a contaminated jar, you're getting repeated exposure every single time you cook, and mycotoxins accumulate in your body. Your kidneys struggle to eliminate them. Nutmeg is typically imported from Indonesia, Grenada, and India. It travels through multiple stages: harvest, processing facilities, shipping containers, warehouses, distribution centers, before it reaches the Schwartz factory or gets packaged as Tesco own brand. At any point in that chain, if moisture levels rise and temperature stays warm, molds can colonize the nutmeg and produce mycotoxins. You cannot see mycotoxins. You cannot smell them. Your jar of Schwartz ground nutmeg looks identical whether it contains 0.1 parts per billion or 10 parts per billion of aflatoxins. The only way to know is through laboratory testing using liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, equipment that costs tens of thousands of pounds and requires trained analysts to operate. Which specific brands tested positive? The FSA doesn't name individual brands in their public surveillance reports. They test samples from retail locations across England and Wales, analyse them, and report aggregate findings. What that means for you is you don't know if the specific jar you bought last week was one of the 9% that exceeded limits or one of the 91% that passed. You're playing odds every time you reach for ground nutmeg. Before you think switching to organic solves this, stop right there. Mycotoxins are produced by molds. Molds are completely natural. They grow whether the nutmeg was cultivated using organic methods or conventional agriculture. But organic ground nutmeg faces exactly the same mycotoxin risk as Tesco value ground nutmeg. The only thing that matters is whether that specific batch was contaminated during its journey from tree to jar. Spice number 3. Turmeric. Turmeric is naturally yellow, but not all turmeric produces the same vibrant golden colour that consumers associate with quality. Some batches are duller, paler, less visually appealing. In India and Bangladesh, which supply the vast majority of turmeric that ends up on UK supermarket shelves, processors discovered they could enhance the colour by adding lead chromate during the polishing process. That's a bright yellow industrial pigment, the same chemical used in road markings and industrial coatings. Why would anyone do this? Because vibrant yellow turmeric commands higher prices. You, as a consumer, see 2 jars of turmeric on the shelf at Tesco. One is pale yellow. One is deep, rich, golden yellow. Your brain automatically associates the richer colour with better quality, higher potency, fresher product. You reach for the brighter jar. Processors know this. By polishing turmeric roots with lead chromate before grinding them into powder, They can pass off lower-grade turmeric as premium product. It also adds weight, which means they're selling less actual turmeric for more money. Studies from Bangladesh documented lead concentrations of up to 483 parts per million in contaminated turmeric samples. That's nearly 200 times higher than the legal limit in that country. Harvard researchers, Stanford scientists, multiple international investigations have all confirmed that lead chromate adulteration of turmeric is an ongoing problem in major spice-exporting nations. Here's why this should terrify anyone with grandchildren or young family members. Lead is a neurotoxin that specifically targets developing brains. In children, lead exposure causes lowered IQ, behavioral problems including ADHD, developmental delays, learning difficulties, and potential lifelong cognitive impairment. There is no safe level of lead exposure for children. None. Every microgram that enters their system does damage that may be irreversible. And it's not just lead you're dealing with. Lead chromate contains hexavalent chromium, the carcinogenic form made infamous by the Erin Brockovich case. It causes cancer, it damages your gastrointestinal system, your respiratory function, your neurological health. You're getting a double hit of toxicity from a single adulterant. But wait, there's more. Turmeric also appeared on the list of products contaminated with ethylene oxide during the 2020-2024 crisis that triggered the biggest food recall in EU history. Ground turmeric from India was found to contain ethylene oxide, a genotoxic carcinogen, at levels far exceeding safety limits. So, depending on which batch you buy, your turmeric could be contaminated with lead chromate, ethylene oxide, or potentially both. Which brands are affected? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Testing for lead chromate requires specialized chemical analysis, looking specifically for lead and chromium in a ratio that indicates the pigment rather than natural mineral contamination. It's not part of routine screening. UK supermarkets don't systematically test every batch of turmeric they stock. The turmeric powder in Tesco, Sainsbury's own brand, Schwartz, East End, Bart, or any other label could theoretically contain lead chromate, and unless someone specifically tests that batch with expensive laboratory equipment, no one would know until people start showing symptoms of lead poisoning. There have been documented cases of children hospitalized with lead poisoning traced back to turmeric used by their families for cooking. The FDA issued multiple turmeric recalls. The pattern is clear. Contaminated turmeric makes it into international commerce, including into countries with supposedly strict food safety standards, because the testing infrastructure isn't there to catch it systematically. Sesame seeds are where everything came to a head in September 2020, and the contamination is still ongoing in 2024. Belgian food safety authorities detected ethylene oxide in sesame seeds imported from India. The contamination levels weren't slightly above the legal limit. We're talking about ethylene oxide detected at more than 1,000 times the maximum residue limit of 0.05 milligrams per kilogram. Within days, alerts spread across Europe. France, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, UK. Country after country started finding the same contamination in their food supply. Ethylene oxide is classified as a mutagen and a carcinogen. That means it can alter your DNA and potentially cause cancer. It's banned for use on food in the UK and across Europe for exactly that reason. But in countries like India, it's still used to fumigate sesame seeds during storage to kill salmonella and other bacteria. When those fumigated seeds enter the UK supply chain, they bring that contamination with them. What followed was described by the EU's Alert and Cooperation Network as the biggest food recall operation in European history. Thousands of products containing contaminated sesame seeds had to be pulled from shelves. We're not just talking about bags of sesame seeds. We're talking about bread with sesame seed toppings, bagels, burger buns, crackers, tahini, hummus, salad dressings, Asian sauces, any product that used sesame seeds or sesame paste as an ingredient. Major UK supermarkets were affected. Products from Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, Waitrose, Morrisons. Recalls rippled through the entire retail system. And here's what should concern you most. According to the EU's Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, ethylene oxide recalls are still being recorded in 2024. This isn't historical contamination that got cleaned up. This is ongoing. The system of checks meant to protect you, border inspections, it's catching some contaminated batches, but experts warn it may only catch a fraction of what's actually being traded worldwide. So when you pick up a bag of sesame seeds from any UK supermarket, whether it's a premium brand or a budget option, you're trusting that particular batch made it through the gauntlet of testing without contamination. But with recalls still happening 4 years into this crisis, that trust might not be justified. The health risk from ethylene oxide isn't acute. You won't get immediately sick from eating a bagel with contaminated sesame seeds. The risk is chronic. Long-term, repeated exposure increases your cancer risk. It's a cumulative effect that builds over months and years of consumption, which is exactly why regulatory limits exist in the first place. And exactly why contamination at 1,000 times those limits is so alarming. Spice number 5, ground ginger. The contamination that spread from sesame seeds. Ground ginger didn't start the ethylene oxide crisis, but it got caught up in the cascade of contamination that followed. As authorities investigated the sesame seed problem, they started testing other spices and ingredients imported from the same regions. Ground ginger from India came back positive for ethylene oxide contamination. The chemical was being used to fumigate multiple products during storage and shipping, and ground ginger, which is typically stored in bulk before packaging, was absorbing ethylene oxide during that process. During the 2020 to 2024 recall operation, products containing ground ginger were pulled from UK supermarkets alongside the sesame seed recalls. Ready meals with ginger in the sauce, spice blends containing ginger, ground ginger sold as a standalone spice, all of it came under scrutiny. But ground ginger faces another potential contamination pathway beyond ethylene oxide. While the documented cases of lead chromate focus primarily on turmeric, the same economic incentives and supply chain vulnerabilities exist for ginger. The ginger you buy at Tesco, whether it's Schwartz ground ginger in the premium spice aisle or Tesco own brand in the value range, comes from the same global supply chains that produced the contaminated batches. Unless that specific batch was tested, and most aren't, you have no assurance it's free from ethylene oxide residues or other adulterants. Ground ginger is particularly problematic because of how extensively it's used. It goes in curries, stir-fries, baking, tea, marinades for meat. If you cook Asian-inspired food regularly, you're using ground ginger multiple times per week. That repeated exposure matters when we're talking about compounds that accumulate or increase cancer risk over time. Spice number 6, curry powder, the contamination multiplier effect. Curry powder isn't a single spice, it's a blend that typically contains turmeric, coriander, cumin, fenugreek, ginger, and various other spices depending on the formulation. That makes it a contamination multiplier. If any of the component spices are contaminated, the curry powder inherits that contamination. During the ethylene oxide crisis, curry powder appeared repeatedly on recall lists because it often contains both contaminated turmeric and contaminated coriander. The Food Safety Authority documented curry powder from multiple suppliers, testing positive for ethylene oxide above legal limits. Think about the math. If turmeric has a 10% chance of ethylene oxide contamination, and coriander has a 10% chance, and ginger has a 10% chance, your curry powder, which contains all three, has a cumulative risk significantly higher than any single component. You're not just rolling the dice once, you're rolling it multiple times with every jar. Some manufacturers do batch testing, many don't. The ones that do testing may only test for specific contaminants, not comprehensive screening. And curry powder faces the same mycotoxin risk we discussed with nutmeg. If the turmeric component was stored in humid conditions and developed mold, those mycotoxins end up in the final curry powder blend. If the coriander was adulterated or contaminated, that carries through. You're getting a potential cocktail of contaminants in a single product. Spice number 7. Ground coriander, ethylene oxide's hidden reservoir. Ground coriander showed up in the ethylene oxide contamination data as another affected product. Like sesame seeds and ginger, coriander from India was being fumigated with ethylene oxide to prevent microbial contamination during storage and shipping. The FSA included ground coriander seeds on their list of products potentially affected by the ethylene oxide crisis. Products containing ground coriander were subject to recalls alongside the other contaminated spices and ingredients. Coriander is used extensively in UK cooking, particularly in South Asian and Middle Eastern cuisine. It goes in curries, spice rubs, marinades, falafel, tagines. If you're cooking from scratch using spices rather than pre-made sauces, you're probably using ground coriander several times per week. The ground form is particularly vulnerable because it has massive surface area relative to whole coriander seeds. When ethylene oxide is used to fumigate storage facilities or shipping containers, ground spices absorb more of the chemical than whole seeds would. That increased absorption means higher residue levels in the final product that reaches your kitchen. Spice number 8. Black pepper, the universal spice with universal contamination risk. Black pepper rounds out our list, and it's particularly concerning because it's literally on every UK dinner table. It's the most widely used spice in Western cuisine. You probably used it today, you'll probably use it again tomorrow. Black pepper appeared on ethylene oxide contamination lists during the 2020-2024 recall crisis. Peppercorns imported from India and other Asian countries tested positive for ethylene oxide residues. The contamination affected both whole peppercorns and pre-ground black pepper. But black pepper faces additional risks beyond ethylene oxide. Because it's such a high-value spice, it's a target for adulteration. There are documented cases of black pepper being bulked out with papaya seeds, spent pepper, the leftover material after essential oils are extracted, or even just black-colored dust and plant material. While the FSA's recent surveillance didn't specifically flag black pepper for this type of fraud, the international food fraud databases show it's a recurring problem globally. The black pepper in your Tesco value range, your Schwartz pepper mill from Sainsbury's, your restaurant-size bag from Costco, all of it comes from global supply chains with documented contamination issues. The difference between brands isn't safety, it's price and packaging. The underlying pepper could come from the same processors, the same warehouses, the same contaminated batches. With pre-ground pepper, you're trusting that what's in the tin is actually pure black pepper, rather than a blend of pepper and filler. After everything we've documented, the mycotoxins, the ethylene oxide, the lead chromate, you still need to cook. Your family still needs to eat. Here's what actually helps. First, buy whole spices whenever possible and grind them yourself. Whole nutmeg instead of pre-ground, whole coriander seeds instead of ground coriander, whole peppercorns in a mill instead of pre-ground pepper, whole turmeric root if you can find it. This eliminates most adulteration pathways and reduces mycotoxin risk because you can inspect what you're buying. Second, rotate your spices every 3 to 6 months rather than keeping them for years. Mycotoxins develop during storage. The longer spices sit in your cupboard, the more opportunity for mold growth. Third, don't assume premium pricing equals safety. Schwartz at £1.50 for 30 grams faces the same contamination risks as East End at £1.50 for 400 grams. They're sourcing from the same global supply chains. Price isn't a proxy for safety. Fourth, stay informed about FSA surveillance results. When new reports come out highlighting contamination in specific spice types, that's your signal to be more cautious with those products. The spices we've covered today: ground nutmeg, oregano, turmeric, sesame seeds, ground ginger, curry powder, ground coriander, black pepper. These aren't theoretical risks. They're current, documented contamination issues affecting products you can buy this week at any UK supermarket. Which of these 8 spices surprised you most? Drop your experience in the comments. And if you want to watch a video like this one, click the video on the screen. Thanks for watching.